to welcome our speaker, who is another University of Michigan and another RCGD alum, Colin Leach, who joins us from Barnard College and Columbia University, where he's a professor of psychology and Africana studies. Colin's research examines race relations through the lens of emotion, morality, and collective action. Or another way of thinking about it is Colin's research looks at emotion, morality, and collective action through the lens of race. Colin is, unlike many of our speakers, not an interdisciplinary scholar. He is a transdisciplinary scholar, meaning that his work doesn't just connect, but really synthesizes economics, sociology, psychology, neuroscience, and increasingly computer science. It also advances an understanding of cognition and affect from a systems perspective to capture how processes feed back on themselves, or how racism operates as a system and not just cause and effect. So this unique approach can help us better understand racial inequality, how people respond or don't respond through protest or indifference, and how people react or don't react to those responses. So please join me in welcoming Colin for his talk, Racialized Sentiment at Violence and Protest.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be back. This is my first time back here in person since 1995. And so a lot has changed, but all the good stuff seems to be the same. So thank you for having me back. Thanks to Nick and Erin for organizing so much. Okay, so let me start with a question. How many of you somehow avoided engagement with the internet today? Really? Yeah. Nothing? No smartphone? Didn't look up anything? No. No email?
Gardening.
You're kind of ruining my whole setup. Almost all of you engaged or were engaged by the internet today. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. But it started somewhere. It's an example of a system that is now ubiquitous in all parts of our life. But in fact, the internet started somewhere, and this little video that I've been showing you is in fact a video of the evolution of the internet. So if some of you are watching it, don't pay attention to Bill Gates right now. We're watching it. It started off as a small cluster with engineering infrastructure, mainly in North America. And it spread non-linearly in a complex spread through North America and then across every continent and now every portion of the globe. But it's a system that operates at multiple levels. So people, obviously, engineering systems, technological innovation, social communication systems, financial systems, and sociological and political systems. But it started somewhere. It was created and then grew into something that now is so real we don't even notice it anymore. And to take a systems view of race, or the way that sentiment, cognition is racialized, is to see it like the internet, as a system that was created but has now been institutionalized and enacted in our lives so much that it's been made real and therefore powerful. And I'm going to try to show you some of the evolution of race around particular issues. So I've been particularly interested since about 2013 in the way that racialized views of the world affect how we think about police use of force or police violence and protest against it. And I've been very focused on the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement as one particularly influential movement. And of course, that movement happened in the context of, in this millennium, it really is the age of protest. For those of us who study movements and protest, at least in recently recorded history, there's no time at which protest was more prevalent than in the last 25 years. And the Black Lives Matter movement is one of the bigger movements within that larger trend all across the world. Okay. So as a system, that means, so this is data from geolocated data from 2020 in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, Minneapolis, which we're studying pretty actively now. It's not what I'm focused on today, but I want to use it as an example to illustrate some things. So this is the geographical distribution of protests in that year period, a bit before and a bit after George Floyd was killed. And you can see here it is distributed asymmetrically or unevenly in population centers, but also in the places where you'd expect this kind of protest given ideological, racial, or other composition. So this is a networked system of protest as it evolved. Now, even if we can understand it as a network, that doesn't mean we necessarily understand it accurately. So this is this data project actually then classifies each one of these protests in terms of its characterization, use of physical violence by the protesters, use of violence by counter-protesters, and destruction of property. So just putting all of that together, violence or property destruction. Of these thousands of protests at that time, in 2020 into 2021, what percentage do you think a reasonable person, not you because you're very informed people, but everybody else, the common person on the street, given what they were seeing in the media, what they were paying attention to, what do you think is like a decent guess as to the percentage of these protests that engage in violence or property destruction? What's a reasonable number? Or is that 5%?
75.
A lot, right? The answer is actually about 4%. And that's actually 3 times that number of demonstrations at the same time by far-right militias and militant movements, which were represented really differently. So not only is it a system that operates and it's distributed in physical space, but in fact, it's a system that then is affected by other systems that I'm going to talk about, like news media representations of what's happening that may have little resemblance to how the system actually evolved. It also was unevenly and non-linearly distributed in time. So this is that count now over time of these protests. And you can see there was a huge peak in the days after George Floyd was killed. And more importantly, the video of his killing circulated widely, lots of protest activity, and then a quick drop off, and then some little perturbations afterwards. So this is what data scientists like to call spiky data. This is nonlinear, non-normal, and also event contingent. Activity is responsive to some dramatic event and then falls off, oftentimes, again, in a nonlinear way, like a precipitous drop. And then other things happen. So it's a system, it also has system dynamics in that way, not only over space, but over time. We could also jump now to social media, which I'll talk a bit about as well. In the days after George Floyd was killed in 2020, the hashtag and phrase Black Lives Matter was used more in those days than in all of the period since it first appeared in social media in 2013. That phrase, Black Lives Matter, came into the wider public consciousness in those days after the video was released. Before that, it was fair to call it a niche way of framing issues of police violence or racial justice. If you knew, you knew, and if you didn't, you didn't. And this, in fact, changed things an awful lot. So if we break that down over time, in fact, even that wide increase in its usage varied in the days immediately after, rose and fall again in nonlinear ways, and in what seemed like event contingent ways. So curfews, other stories being released, and very importantly, the evolution now not just of attention to George Floyd's killing, but competing attention, as I'm going to try to demonstrate, to the protests in response to George Floyd's killing. So now we can talk about social media discourse and discussion also varying in system ways unevenly over time. Sentiment toward Black Lives Matter also changed dramatically in that period. There were some well-established linear trends. Opposition was falling, support was rising. This is among white folks who are the only major ethnic group in the US who haven't supported Black Lives Matter consistently for the whole time since its existence. But there were these strong linear trends of falling opposition and rising support, and they were dramatically exaggerated by the release of the video. So the upward trend was accelerated again in a very dramatic way after the Ahmaud Arbery video was killed. He was released. He's a jogger who was hunted down and killed. And then you can see, I like this graph because if you don't understand what nonlinear is, that's your best example. It goes from horizontal to vertical. Support jumped in a cataclysmic way in those days after the video was released. And this is the first and only time that white folks in the US, in representative samples, supported Black Lives Matter more than they opposed it. In the days after, oops, sorry. Where's my animation? There we go. It shifted very quickly. And basically went back to where it was, not before the George Floyd video, but where it was when this data first started getting tracked in 2017. So this again is an example of systems dynamics where even an upward trend, you could even call it a progressive trend if you want, can be reversed, exaggerated in one way and reversed in the next in response to events. Okay, let me pause for a second, and I forgot to warn you. So a lot of what we're doing here is to try to understand these dynamics is actually examining the circulation of and examining responses to visual representations of these kinds of things that I'm talking about. And I haven't shown you any yet, but to show you what we've done, like in a methodological way to show you the stimuli, but also to show you what's circulating, I want to show you those images. And I just want to warn you, I think you've probably seen many of them before, but you may not have seen all of them. And they can be disturbing. And that's exactly what we're trying to study. But I just want to warn you that I am going to have to show you some of those images. Okay. So we've already tried to give you a taste here of this ecological approach to systems that we're trying to understand. We want to understand the multiple systems of cognition and emotion, which I'll talk about, situated in societal systems like social media, like news media. And so this is Bronfenbrenner's classic ecological model. And so we want to understand this macro system of race as a way of, as a lens of understanding these things across these different levels. And so I'm going to talk about news media, headlines and featured images of news media and the way that they circulate and the way that they represent these kinds of events as one influence on us and as one lens into competing representations of these racial inequality debates. I'm going to talk about social media, in this case, Twitter, as one lens into public discourse around these issues and the social dynamics of that. And I also want to talk about the systems within us that are influencing what we make of this stuff to which we're exposed and that lead us to contribute to them by posting or saying something, expressing some view. So in essence, I want to be talking about the way that we make sense of these issues as systems within systems. Systems within us, interacting with the systems outside of us immediately, who we're talking to in the world, and larger macro systems of news media and social media discussion. And all these systems operating at the same time, coming through us and us contributing to them, them coming back to us. So I hope you get your Wheaties today, because this is gonna be a little bit of a demanding thing. Now, our overarching framework is one, in fact, that I studied and talked a lot to one of my favorite professors who's here in the front row, Phoebe Ellsworth, who helped contribute to the development of appraisal theories. And it actually is still one of my favorite theories, and I use it all the time, and it has guided this work. Don't get mad at me. I'm going to use not your favorite person's version of this theory, though, maybe. Klaus. That's okay? All right, great. So appraisal theory, it's useful to me because it's a theory that actually, in fact, I remember when Phoebe gave a class about appraisal theory, and I remember, you probably don't remember, this is probably like 1992. And I was like, Phoebe, is it sequential? Does it matter? You probably don't remember this. And I was obsessed with whether it matters, whether the order matters. And I'm going to say today, it does matter. Appraisal theory argues that when we try to make sense of the world, we engage in this Shearer's version, sequential process of judgments to make sense of it. From novelty, is it different? Does it command my attention? Unpleasantness, how does it feel? Relevance, does it matter to me or to my goals or values somehow? Coping potential, what can I do about it? Compatibility, do other people that I care about or norms think that it matters in the same way that I do, for example? And that we make these judgments and they build on each other. And of course, there's a strong assumption in a lot of cognitive psychology and cognitive science that they do flow one to another. So what's relevant? Stuff that stands out. Things that are novel or unusual in our environment command our attention, and we need to figure out, are they friend or foe? Are they benefit or threat? And so they engage us. So this theory sort of argues that that happens over time, those judgments get made, and you can see already in the quality of them that they get more and more cognitively elaborate, maybe even more intentional or deliberative. It's also the case in this version that I use that the argument is that different systems within us, cognitive physiological systems, come online throughout this process, and they have a temporal sequence as well. So quicker systems, like our neurological cognitive systems of attention that drive attention to novelty, for example, or visceral reactions, physiological reactions of blood flowing to the extremities, getting ready to act, show some sign of relevance and whether it matters to me that I need to actually engage my body. And we begin to have a sense of affect, whether this feels good or bad to me. And we might elaborate and build on that and judge whether this matters to me. Why does it matter to me? Does it go against my goals of morality and fairness? And therefore, this building sense that something's wrong turns into some more elaborate cognitively labeled state like anger. And is that related to wanting to do something like fix that wrong? And then it maybe looks like something like moral outrage. And do I think about what I can do to fix that wrong? And do other people agree with me that it's wrong? And are they willing to act with me to correct the wrong? So this is, again, a systems view of multiple systems within us, working with our cognitive system to make judgments that prepare us for feeling and action. Embedded in judgments of whether other people are reinforcing those judgments and are with us or not. Whether they're socially validated by other people, for example. So thinking about those microsystems, if you will, or within person systems, operating within those macro systems, if you will, we've taken 3 different approaches. And these 3 different approaches are because the systems that I'm talking about each have their own dynamics and they have their own parameters. They have their own temporal course. They have their own methods that make sense to study them. And so I'm just going to give you a taste of each one of these 3 approaches. So I'm going to show you some small scale experiments that are really influenced by cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience that are in some ways a traditional EEG type study, but guided by this systems view of race and racialization of cognition and emotion. I'm going to give you a taste of so-called big data analyses of news media coverage of a similar issue and how that's racialized. And if we're not all exhausted by then and we have a little time left, I'm going to tell you about some analyses of social media, of Twitter. Now, we're working a lot on the 2020 dynamics after George Floyd was killed, but I actually want to talk about an earlier time for a couple of different reasons. So I'm going to talk, when I go into the big data, actually about 2014, in the aftermath of the killing of Mike Brown and the protest movement in Ferguson. I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. One is it was just the 10th anniversary of Mike Brown's killing in August. And secondly, this is actually an analysis before Black Lives Matter came into the public consciousness. As I showed you in 2020, it became such a common way of framing things that it actually changed things a lot. So this is before that frame was available. How were people offering racialized interpretations of what was happening? Or another way to put that is, the question is, where did Black Lives Matter come from? Okay. So, as I just said, right, that's 2020. Invite me back, I can talk about that. I want to talk about all this. From when it first appeared as a hashtag when George Zimmerman was acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin, through Mike Brown's killing in Ferguson and a whole series of killings of unarmed Black people around that time, through lots of names that you may or may not know, to right before 2020. Okay. So we did a series of experiments in our EEG lab. And basically what we did to make this work power-wise and design-wise was, for 2 years, we recruited every Black student on campus and then had a matched number of white students. And there's lots of interesting inside baseball kind of details about how to do this kind of study and the way that EEG research has dealt with race in the past. It's very interesting, and I got a real education about that, which I'm happy to discuss in questions and answers. I learned a lot. But let me just cut to the chase and say that none of the established EEG researchers that I consulted with and I asked to kind of work with us wanted to do this study. They thought it was a terrible idea, because race in EEG research is isolated expressionless faces with no context, and therefore nothing but the color of people's skin as race. And also, there's a debate there about what is happening in attention and cognition when people see those decontextualized faces that only represent race as color. Some people argue that there's an in-group prominence effect, that we're biased toward attending to people of same race. Other people argue, no, there's a potential out-group threat explanation. We pay attention to other race faces, and that novelty response drives everything. And so we thought, well, in fact, neither one of those sounds right, actually, if you think about race as a social system. This is going to depend on who you are. If you have very little racial socialization and understanding of how race works, especially around use of police force and Black protests against it, then you should have a typical novelty response. You don't think about this, you don't read about this, it stands out, it's going to grab your attention. But that doesn't mean you care about it. And if you've been racially socialized, and I mean racially socialized here not as something specific to who you are, but to what you've been exposed to, you have some knowledge of how these things work, you've thought about the way that policing might be racialized or protests might be racialized, this is not going to stand out or be surprising and be very novel, but you probably care about it. So novelty and relevance appraisals will actually be disconnected. One won't lead to the other, which is completely different hypothesis from what you would generate from the two competing ones in the work on race and EEG. But again, is informed by thinking about race as a system and thinking about it as one that guides people's attention. Okay, so what's the other thing here I have to mention? Yes, so as expected, our Black and white students came in with a standard deviation difference in how aware they were of Black victims, unarmed victims of police use of force in the media. So that's a very healthy effect size. And the way that we did this was subtly, we showed people a really brief picture and a little description, like a name and very little detail, and then ask them, do you know what this is? Do you know about this? Is it familiar? Tell us. That's it. And of course, Black students came in, maybe not of course, but in this case, Black students came in knowing a lot more about these incidents. Okay. We designed a carefully controlled set of images of police use of force against Black targets. Let's see if this works. Yeah. Carefully controlled and matching set of police force against white targets, and then images of Black-led protest. So some things to note. These images were all shown between a second and a half. So they were a little quicker than you just saw. Their time to process color of skin, probably not time to read that sign very well. But what people attend to when images are flashing this clearly, and these images were chosen to represent a very clear iconography or visual form. And that is, the police are always above in an expanded dominant posture, with the target always in a subordinate position or posture. The targets are always expressing some degree of distress, even though the form of physical violence varies and is more or less extreme. You don't always see information that leads you to make a judgment about who the police officer is or what their group membership is. But you recognize it's a police officer physically subordinating somebody. The images of protest also had a very consistent iconography. They were expanded postures that you could call, for lack of a better word, empowered. So the opposite of the physical subordination. Now we have lots of variations of these images, but these are really the core set to instantiate these ideas that this is really about subordination by an authority or an empowered reaction against that subordination. Okay, so the typical setup, right? Our participants come in, they're seeing these images flash on the screen, they've got their little EEG cap, although it's pretty big. We're measuring blood pressure and heart rate and some other physiology. They're there for 2 hours with us, and we expose them to lots of images. And we're trying to trace over time, from the first fractions of a second to seconds to minutes, this appraisal process. And then moving to linguistic markers and getting to reflect and use words to tell us what they're experiencing, what they're feeling, what's happening in the pictures. That's what typical event-related potential data looks like. I'm not going to show it to you that way because when I break it down by those conditions, it's very complicated to understand, but it's all in the paper and I'm happy to share it with you and give you more detail. I'm going to summarize it for you. The early indicators of novelty and the later indicators of relevance, which include, for those of you who are into this kind of thing, the late positive potential, event-related potential, and systolic blood pressure, showed a very distinct pattern. And these effect sizes are 5 or 6 or 10 times the size of the ones typical in this literature. There are also much more homogeneous effects than in the literature, because when you show people pallid stimuli, you get pallid responses that are variable and full of error. The signal is lost in the noise. White participants showed a very strong in their early ERPs, what looks really consistent in the literature with a novelty response. And remember, they're less familiar. Makes sense. But not much late positive potential or systolic blood pressure increase relative to baseline to suggest that they continue to engage and that it mattered to them. Exact opposite pattern for Black participants. So greater change in systolic blood pressure compared to baseline, greater late positive potential. Okay, so this was in response to Black targets at police use of force. Remember, existing work on race and social cognition argues that there's either an in-group or an out-group, right, attention bias. I would say race as a system argues that what matters here, and you can already see in our stimuli the way that we built this, is what really matters more than the target is the police. This is about police use of force. And in fact, when you compare Black participants' responses to the white cops' use of force, it's almost exactly the same. White participants is also almost exactly the same for white targets of police use of force. What explains this? Their pre-existing difference in how aware they were of Black victims in the media. Fully explains this difference between Black and white participants. So again here, race in this case is a contextualized knowledge that they came to the study with and seem to be applying to these new instances that they've never seen. White participants, when we ask them a little bit later, express surprise at police use of force. Black participants express being attentive, engaged. So also when we ask them their subjective experience, they report something really consistent with what's happening in the first second or fraction of a second. And the pattern is very similar for those images of Black-led protest. So for us, this is an example of how understanding cognition in a more ecological systems way leads you away from thinking about groups as these objective features of the ecology and really locates this in understanding that the way that the beliefs that we have lead us to interpret novel instances. It also, I think, importantly, challenges this idea that novelty is what drives continued attention to relevance. Some things matter to some of us more than others, even if we've never seen it before. Just going to pause for a second and drink some water and see if there are any questions.
So your surprise effect, is that on the N100?
Well, yes, the surprise is what people say, but that pattern, yes.
Right, so Tiffany Ito has some work showing that that N100 is modulated by RET, particularly outward RET. So is there a way to confirm that in these data?
Yeah, so we actually use three different, from 100 to 300 milliseconds, three different ERPs, and they're all really consistent. So it's not specific to the N100, partly because of that concern. So Tiffany's one of the people I talked to.
Great, okay, so it's
Yeah.
an aggregate.
Yeah, this is a summary of actually three different ERPs. N100 is only one of them, and actually the effect is the weakest on the N100.
So it's more like N2?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, it's a great question. Yeah.
Do you think that effect is seen because white participants aren't as exposed to the images, or do you think it's more of a they're not retaining the images, or they are?
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
I'm going to try to give you some other kinds of evidence that are suggestive, but in this case for here, what we know is this is really about, let's call it knowledge of related past incidents. That's the local explanation, but I think it is broader to exposure, to news media and social media, but let me come to that. That's the rest of the story, but thanks. All right, you ready for some more? You ready for some more? You don't sound convinced, okay. So obviously, awareness of unarmed Black victims of police use of force is a media-driven explanation in that previous study, right? People are exposed to it in conventional news media or social media or otherwise. So we thought, let's actually study news media. And what's a little different about this, again, thinking about how issues like this are represented, in this case, again, the 2014 killing of Mike Brown and the subsequent protests in Ferguson, is we actually had, again, this idea that because of how race works, that in fact, Black-oriented and mainstream news media might be very different in how this story is reported. And this might be part of why our Black and white students come in with such different knowledge. And so we went out of our way to compare or to make sure in our database that we created that we took the top 51 mainstream online sources, but also the top 18 African-American oriented news sources with the keyword Ferguson to compare these two different sources of news media. Here they are. I don't know if you can see that. They vary quite a lot in the political leaning of their audience. They really go from far right to pretty far left, although it's hard to find a left enough example to match the far rightedness of the farthest right one, but they range quite a bit. And so we analyzed headlines, the words in headlines, and featured images. And headlines are one way to very effectively, for an audience, represent an event. And the language that you use makes dramatic differences. So Ferguson, Missouri community furious after teen shot dead by police. So this locates it in Ferguson. It tells you maybe there's something questionable. It was a teen. And it gives you a little hint that maybe race is relevant somehow. Maybe. Give you some clues as to what you might be thinking about. You could read this headline and see that image and think like, oh, did the police kill somebody Black? You could wonder. Police shooting in Missouri sparks angry protests. This is a very different framing. Talking about the response to the shooting, no suggestion necessarily that the protest might be legitimate or might have cause. So there are lots of different ways that something like this killing can be represented in headlines and with images. These are probability estimates of the likelihood of images of Black-led protests or police in the featured images. And the mainstream news is full of images that show angry protesters and often militarized, but not always, police responses. Now, of course, you could have a different framing of this, which is the reason why the protesters and the police were in the street in the first place, right? There's a picture missing here. Mike Brown. Now you're not going to trust me because you think I'm trying to fool you, but I'm not. I want your honest answer. What percentage of featured images in this news coverage at that time had a picture, any picture, of Mike Brown? The whole reason why this was happening. 5? This is kind of cynical, don't you think? It's worse than that. Less than 1%. Any picture of Mike Brown. Now, let me just break this down a little bit for you. This is political leaning of the source. So I told you it's an asymmetric distribution. So -2 is the left-leaning sources, +4 is the right-leaning sources, because there's an outlier out here, which I've labeled for you. This is independent of political leaning of the source. It's unrelated to these probabilities of these different images appearing in the article. But what is related to that probability, whether it's a general public or Black-oriented source. Black-oriented newspapers were much less likely to have featured images of protesters or the police. And more likely, although it's still a very low number, to have images of Mike Brown. Let me show this to you a different way. The probability of various ways of representing what was happening. So you can see the general sources in green, the African-American sources in black. So you can see police caption and titles, police images, protest captions and titles, protest images, all much more likely in mainstream media. But actual explanations of what was happening and mention of Mike Brown much more likely in Black-oriented media. So this is really in some ways a popular news media instantiation of this movement of say her name or say their name, that the name and the person are much more likely to appear in Black-oriented media. And in mainstream media, you could very reasonably infer from the articles or the featured images that there's a protest happening because someone got killed. Who knows why? Who knows how? Okay, we're doing it right on time. Now, news media, of course, is a very particular kind of media. So we have some projects with Columbia School of Journalism where we collaborate around news framing and the use of media sources and their influence. And I thought they'd be really interested in this finding. There's basically a flat relationship between political orientation of the news source and their likelihood of having these images. They were very uninterested in that finding and didn't believe it. And then they explained to me how this happens. And this is actually not about what you might think with news media, about like who's writing those articles. This is a product of the institutionalization of news media in this country, where those images and those headlines are written by someone completely different than the person actually reporting on the events. So this is a more very institutionalized choice about how to represent these events that in fact actual reporters have very little to do with. And as probably many of you know, those headlines and those images are chosen for a different reason, which is to attract attention. Not to represent what was happened or to raise questions about its legitimacy. Okay. Now, of course, because news media operates in a very particular way, and of course, because many people no longer rely on news media for news, we've just kind of recently crossed a threshold where younger people under the age of 25 now rely more on social media sources, including TikTok, for news and information than for traditional news sources. But it's also the case that, as I mentioned, social media has been a place where people could represent information and do citizen news in a way that was different because of their response to what's represented in news media. So we know that communities use social media and other sources as an alternative way of sharing information and producing news. Now, of course, that's an old phenomenon, right? That's old ethnic newspapers, for example, serve that purpose. But this is a new version of that. And so we also then wanted to dig into how this issue was discussed in social media when Twitter was Twitter and it was very popular and actually had a wide range of people. It really did operate for a while as a public commons. And so we wanted to examine how people were talking about these kinds of things on Twitter. So I've already showed you a different version of this. This is actually on a different time scale of use of Black Lives Matter on Twitter, how it jumps exponentially to 10 million per day sometimes after the killing of George Floyd. But I want to go back and focus on, so right now I'm talking about around this period on social media. So there was an exponential jump in discussion of these issues on Twitter around this time that then jumped again in 2020. And so we wanted to go back to that time in the social media discussion of Mike Brown and what was happening in Ferguson to see if we could understand where Black Lives Matter came from, as I mentioned to you. So we collaborated with some mainly communication researchers who created this fantastic data set of over 40 million tweets of a year period. Mike Brown's killing is kind of in the beginning of this, but it includes a lot of different ones, including Eric Garner's killing in Staten Island, New York. So I've given you some kind of prominent names that you might know there. And the nice thing about this data set is even though it includes the hashtag Black Lives Matter and other related ones around racial justice, it's actually very focused on the names of the people who were killed. So it's basically people talking about that topic, that event, rather than a framing of that event like Black Lives Matter. Already in the hours after Mike Brown's killing in August 2014, you could see Twitter discussion offering an alternative view of mainstream news media. So these are the first tweets. And they're actually coming from a local reporter in Ferguson, Tef Poe, who is a local MC and local activist who was in the neighborhood at the time. And he's the one who posted this then infamous picture of Mike Brown dead in the street that then circulated and then got picked up by mainstream news media. And you can now see a very different kind of way of talking about what's happening. The lifeless body of the unarmed 17-year-old kid, please help us expose this attempted cover up. To everyone on a worldwide level to help us push this story, thank you. And then it's getting retweeted and spreading and getting picked up by news media. And then people are starting to engage the discussion. He has a name, Mike Brown, 17 years old, was shot and killed by the police in Ferguson, Missouri. He was unarmed. Retweet, spread the news. So this is the beginnings, the very beginnings of that evolution of social media discussion around this issue. And we wanted to think, interested in whether it has a different quality. You can already see some ways where it seems to have a different quality than mainstream news coverage of it. So for example, and again, you're gonna see here system dynamics at play over time. So this is a time series over the days of August in 2014. This is hashtag usage. So in those first few days of August, folks on Twitter were still talking about the killing of Eric Garner in New York, which had happened a couple of weeks before. The 9th is when Mike Brown is killed. That's this green line. So that's any reference, any hashtag that includes the word Mike Brown. It begins to now supersede discussion of Eric Garner and reference to Ferguson. And I want you to notice there that the use of the Ferguson and Mike Brown hashtags, very obviously, I could give you a number, but you don't need a number. They're positively correlated. They're moving together. Protests start the 10th, the 11th, the 12th. This is an inflection point. Ferguson becomes a much more common way of talking about this. Mike Brown less. And now that correlation has completely reversed, and now it's strongly negative as a fraction of tweets. It ebbs and flows. So Mike Brown gets more mention when the name of the cop who killed him circulates. Little rise, little dip. The National Guard is called in. The 25th is when a publicly broadcast, quite public mourning of Mike Brown happens at his funeral. We again see that dip, fall in Ferguson, rise in mentions of Mike Brown, and then it goes back to form. So again, you can see here nonlinear dynamics that appear to be event contingent. And importantly, these two ways of talking about it, Ferguson versus Mike Brown, after that initial day or two, are actually opposite. This correlation is minus 0.71, which is about as big as you could expect in the world. If I take out those first couple of days, it's even stronger, where they're positive. So two competing framings. And these two competing framings are basically, when you look at the content of the tweet, the exact two that I showed you in the news media. Ferguson is about the protests, their appropriateness, the police response, some mention of Mike Brown as a cause. Mike Brown is about the possible racial injustice. He was 17, he was unarmed, that seems unnecessary. This is a heat map visualization of the relative ranking from dark to light here of the hashtags, the most prominent hashtags. They're ranking over time. This is going to show you something similar, but it's going to give you a little bit more nuance of how the discussion evolved over time. So this is already what I showed you. So you can see these black or dark purple boxes are highly ranked, top 5, top 10 ranking hashtags. And you can see the discussion in those first few days of August to the 8th or the 9th are still about Eric Garner, about the NYPD. Mike Brown is killed. Now we see a shift to talking about Mike Brown killed in Ferguson. Protests start to happen. Now people are talking about protests in Ferguson. They're talking about a particular form of protest, hands up, don't shoot. And only later, toward the end of the month, do you see a prominent hashtag, Black Lives Matter. It emerges at the end of this sequence, as I'm going to show in a slightly different way. And it actually emerges a little bit after a competing framing of this that begins to emerge after the protests reach their height, which is TCOT. Anybody know what TCOT stands for? It's gone out of style. Conservatives on Twitter. So lots of discussion of Mike Brown being killed, protests in Ferguson early in the period, continues, and then late in the period, 2 competing framings of what's happening. Black Lives Matter and TCOT. And I can show you over time, if I show you this a different way, these are correlations with time and correlations with Black Lives Matter. So you can just see here over time, references to Ferguson or Mike Brown or use the hashtag go down. References to TCOT and Black Lives Matter go up. Later usage of Black Lives Matter is most correlated to references to TCOT and to the hands up, don't shoot movement. So Black Lives Matter emerges only late in this period and not in response to discussion of Ferguson or Mike Brown, but infused by this particular form of protest that happens later in the movement, hands up, don't shoot. And they're engaging, and I'm going to show you in a second, arguing with the alternative viewpoint of TCOT. So Black Lives Matter and TCOT are where we end up at the end of the month as competing frames of what happened to Mike Brown and Ferguson. How do we know that? We can actually do a social network analysis of this activity to see who's talking to whom about what. So these are actually bio-identity markers of people. So these are people, what's nice about this is we're actually analyzing people's tweets in August 2014 and using how they identify years later. So in fact, we have a little piece of this project. So 2014 August is before MAGA language is common, but we can actually predict who begins to identify that way given their tweets about Ferguson in 2014. So this is the evolution of that network and that conversation right after Mike Brown's killed. I can tell you more about this if you want. This is where it goes. And basically we begin to see toward the end of that period, in the beginning of the middle of that period, the days after Mike Brown is killed, we begin to see constellations of people engaging with each other who tend to be kind of aligned with them, and then opposite responses. But the point here is you can see that this is all mashed together because people are engaging each other across these communities. And over time, those strands get tighter and tighter within the communities and looser across communities. So we can see a lot of engagement early, debate, discussion, and then I think I'll probably stop here. Let me just jump to this. We can see that here in terms of a couple of these statistics of summarizing the connection in social networks. And I just want to point out that orange line, degree assortativity. So typically the way that this works in networks is there are people who are influential with lots of followers, and people who are less influential with not many followers. And often, the people with lots of followers who are the popular influencers are talking to their followers, right? And that's how we think about influence. In those days when everyone was talking to everyone and engaging, this interesting event contingent nonlinear spike happened, where in fact, the influencers with the most followers were talking to each other and they're debating what happened. And the people with few followers are debating with each other about what happened. But it's a disruption in many ways of that normal influence process where it's the most popular people talking to their followers. And then as things settle down, the polarization starts to happen and people pull apart. Then we get back into that intergroup dynamic of I'm talking to my audience. I'm preaching to my choir. But there was that moment that I just showed you in the network that we can also see here where people were actually talking across those ideological lines and debating. And then it begins to separate and polarize as they can't come to an agreement about what happened and what it means. So working on these different models, I think for me has led me to think about what a systems psychology might look like and how there might be a way to think about or take our systems approaches to emotion, cognition, and behavior and to see them as coordinating or articulating with larger social systems. And they could be whatever. They could be social networks, they could be social media networks, they could be news media. But really genuinely trying to make an effort to see the systems within us as existing within larger systems and to see that interchange back and forth. And then I think a more disturbing thing is I think what I've just shown you is in fact, especially in that last bit of data, but also in the news media, you can see the evolution of dissensus. And you can actually see that talking to each other doesn't necessarily lead to consensus or agreement. Talking to each other in that moment, this is probably exactly what happened in 2020 after George Floyd was killed. There was a lot of exchange, right? A lot of excitement. Let's use this to understand our world better. And then a similar process of we can't agree, and so we're gonna move away from each other and extrematize and polarize. The problem is, and trust me, this slide was written before the recent election, the problem is that not understanding the social and psychological dynamics of dissensus, that actually it's a product of interaction, not siloed, separate, but actually talking to each other and disagreeing. It's actually a product of that. Not understanding that, I think, leads us to not understand the way that a deep dissensus, and I mean not just in interaction, but deep dissensus also in how we see and process the world, what we pay attention to, what moves us. Not understanding how deep that dissensus goes, I think challenges or doesn't help us understand how deep a challenge this dissensus is to common notions of fairness, truth, justice, democracy. If we can't see the world in some similar way at some basic level and agree on how it should operate, then we can't do much together. I'm sorry I've gone a little long. I know I've been really demanding of your attention, but so thank you very much for sticking with me this long. I look forward to your questions.
I'd like to open up for questions for a speaker.
Yeah, I'll come to you next to you. Sorry, that's somebody behind you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was just really interested in this last point about dissensus, and if you have had any, the sort of idea that interaction can actually make things worse rather than better. So I'm just curious in any of your data, Twitter data or the brain data, if there's any moderators in there that could give us hope or insight into how to facilitate productive interaction versus destructive interaction.
Yeah. Any hope? Let me think for a second. That might give me a minute.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. I probably said that a little less, in a less nuanced way than I meant to. So it's not any interaction, it's bad interaction, right? So especially when we don't have common ground about what's fair or right, but we've got to come to some way of agreeing on that. So I think that's one lesson, right? Like one answer to this is to re-engage in models of civil discourse and ground rules, and take seriously and make it intentional that we actually need to agree on some basic judgments. Now this is funny, right? Because every community in human history has had to decide on some basic ground rules for how we treat each other, right? And we agree on them. And we agree that if you don't follow them, there's some consequence. And that's, I think that's inherent to social living, right? Chimpanzees do it, we do it. And so I think we're underestimating how much of that we've lost and how much we need to be intentional about getting it back. So that's my short answer. The longer answer would be we're actually trying to dig deeper into actual interactions. So this is a AI project with my computer science colleagues where we're using a kind of a model that's fallen out of fashion, an interpersonal circumplex, to try to actually see people's social orientations to their conversation partner and to predict inflection points where the probability of the conversation breaking down because you don't have enough common ground happens. That's actually very hard to do, like a person really trained in group dynamics or a really good marriage counselor could probably do it, but we're not great at doing that. And so that's one way we're trying to get insight into what are the things, are the points where you can't go back, right? They're the thing that you say or the orientation that you take to the other person that increases the probability dramatically of the conversation ending without basic agreement. So there's some progress there, but it's going to take that really using a enriched dynamic model to use all the cues, and that's a multimodal model. So that's looking at the words that people say, it's looking at prosody, the vocal quality of the words, the vocal content, gaze, physical posture, topic. We're really trying to get down to that level to see if we can train the model to predict those key inflection points. But we have some more to do to get it, but you can scale that up, right? That's about a dyadic conversation. But the same principle should apply. And that would be really getting into the social dynamics of polarization rather than assuming that it's just a separation. It's really digging into the process before the separation, how it happens. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Phoebe.
I was actually sort of pleasantly surprised that people are talking to each other at all.
Yeah.
An event like this, and I just would imagine everybody just talking to people they already agree with the way they usually do. And so I'm very curious about what happens in those conversations, and it sounds as though that's just what you're starting to look at now. So you're two people with possibly good intentions start out and then mess up immediately.
Yeah.
So have you got any data on that?
We do. So there's a lot of things to choose. I gave you a very social dynamics oriented talk, but there's another version of this where we really dig into the content of what people are saying. And so it's definitely clear that there are speech communities, for lack of a better word, emerging. People begin to talk about these events in particular ways. And there's some that talk across each other, but they're already beginning to build a collective framing of things. So for example, I thought about this and I took it out. So Mike Brown's funeral is really interesting, and these funerals are really interesting. So we have a paper that's focused on collective grief and mourning, specifically around what happens around funerals. And when funerals gain a lot of attention and they become a collective event, how people are talking about their funeral in their speech communities has huge effects on what they make of it and what they feel about it. So for example, there are two really similar ways of talking about Mike Brown's funeral that look almost exactly alike in the content of their tweets, except one is explicitly racialized and one is not. And those two groups of people have very different reactions to the funeral. For the people who are talking about what happened before the funeral as racialized, they show extremely negative emotion leading up to the funeral and the day of the funeral. And that's more true the more they participated, the more they tweet about it, the more they say they watched it, the more they engage in the collective act of grief. The folks who are talking about the same thing, oh, somebody was killed in Ferguson, there's protests, but it's not racialized, are flat emotion-wise the day of the funeral. So that's also underlying here. I kind of gave you an overview, but the way that people are dividing themselves, it's not just ideological, it's also actually about content. And this is really driving how people are experiencing the conversations. And then there's a third speech community at that time that's very different. And these are people who are talking about what's happening in Ferguson and Mike Brown's killing in community, solidarity, for lack of a better word, like spiritual ways. And we call them the collective mourners. For them, the funeral is not just grief or marking that somebody was killed, it's actually a collective act of mourning that's actually energizing. And you see this flip again. For them, we can predict their positive emotion after the more negative emotion they feel during the funeral and the day of the funeral, the more positive they feel after the funeral, which is not true for anybody else. Because they seem to be giving the funeral a different meaning and energizes. So that's actually the level I normally focus on, like these speech communities, which overlap with the ideological but are not the same. So there are lots of, not MAGA, but there are lots of conservatives who are engaging in some of those speech communities and are expressing grief and are upset if they're conservatives engaged in that speech community. Their feelings and reporting are being influenced by that speech community. Yeah, come around. You're supposed to be helping me keep track of this.
I'll actually do that to that line of the question since it's related to the answer you just gave.
Okay.
The story there you're telling is one of shocks and perturbations, and what comes after. But I'm not clear if what comes after is reversion, or just kind of returning to whatever state that system's at before, or if it's one finding a new like local minimum, or if it kind of depends. Like, how would you characterize the response to these shocks? Is either reversion or some, is it more a sort of continuity, or is it like punctuated by disturbances, or is it more a story of change that's prompted by these disturbances?
Yeah, I would say it depends on who you're talking about. So definitely the people who are sort of in the middle, like that first group that I talked about that is talking about what happened in deracialized ways, they are showing something more like what you're describing, like this homeostatic model, right? There's an interruption and they go back to baseline. The people who are really engaged don't look the same after than they did before, right? Like the collective mourners, they are moving all over the place. And this is partly because, we have a paper that talks about, that really digs into this. So let me just think about how to say this. There are different ways to think about time and events. And so like, for example, the EEG work and event-related potentials, it's event contingent, but there's always, kind of that waveform has a shape, right? Like I react and then it falls off. And that's usually the way you talk about things over time. But proper event contingency in a system perspective means if I'm profoundly changed, if my action actually changed who I am and what I'm about, I don't go back to baseline, I have a new baseline. And so I've really been influenced by George Bonanno's work on grieving in this way, that there are these different trajectories of grief, and some of them are not homeostatic. You don't go back to baseline, your baseline changes. And so it depends who you are. For people who aren't that engaged or for whom it's not that relevant, they are getting back to baseline and they probably can't wait to get back to baseline. But there are other people, like the collective mourners, who are changed such that there's a new baseline and it's taking them into the next response to the event. So every event is actually having, I'm sorry if I'm using too much jargon here, but it's more like less of a homeostatic process and more of an emergent one, that all this series of events are actually changing where I start the next time, or they're lowering my threshold to respond. Now, of course, you can take that too far. You can reach exhaustion, right? I've increased my baseline so much by reacting that now I don't have any more resources to react and I fall flat. But we're trying to actually examine all the different models of change, and they're not all homeostatic. There isn't always a return to baseline. That actually happens for the least interested people, the least engaged. Does that make sense? You want to start? I don't know, come around this way, I'm sorry. I don't know.
I'm curious how you think about the genres of writings on Twitter, and especially in 2014, it had a smaller character count. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about dissensus as it relates to the different operations and genres that people are writing in. And I think the speech community answers a part of that question because they're trying to do different things. But when we compare like protest organization as a genre, right? Instructions go there where God wants, to the collective mourning, to the information circulation. So I'm wondering if dissensus is able to capture that a singular person might work in different genres with the same set of aims. Because partly I worry, I do totally agree that Twitter in 2014 did have a public town hall, you know, a town hall kind of feeling. However, it's so different than conversation, even though we have threads and reactions. So I'm just curious how much that can stand in for intergroup conversation, given that a singular person might work in different genres, and can we collapse across those genres? Or should we, now I'm just moving into speculation, but I'm wondering how you think about genre writing in Twitter and dissensus.
Yeah. I mean, the nice thing about this time, about the 140 characters, is that it focused minds, right? People were quite clear about what they could say in 140 characters. And so in many ways, so I've worked with lots of Twitter data since I've been working with the 2020 Twitter data. And partly I'm very focused on 2014 because it's better data, because people are actually expressing themselves better. There's much more clarity, there's much more purpose, now that might be exaggerated because natural language is not that way actually, it doesn't operate that way, and conversation certainly doesn't. But there was something special about that public commons thing where people were really engaging in what feels like a more intentional discourse and discussion, which is less true even by 2020 and is definitely less true now. So in many ways, it's a kind of idealized communication, I would say, and it may be even more systematic because of that. But there are lots of other ways to do it, right? So the news media is a different way. We have a project now that might address sort of what you're saying. I talked about the dyadic one, but we have a project now where, I don't know if some of you maybe remember this, Gillette razors had an ad campaign about 2 years ago. And you know what's their motto? The best a man can get. And so they developed this 1 60-second commercial that was basically responsive to the Me Too movement. And basically, you know, a kind of a call for men to rethink masculinity in the context of Me Too. And it was posted on YouTube, and millions of people responded with comments in the days after, and it turned into this debate. But it was an expression of something that we're actually coding in that multimodal way that I said as one beginning of the conversation, but then the audience are all talking to each other about the ad. And so we can see these same dynamics in a different way. Those are actually very short expressions, but then people are arguing with each other about what Gillette said. And so there's some way where that genre of writing is a little different. The dynamics are different because you're commenting and then you're commenting on people's comments, and then we can see which comments are influential, but all in the context of this message that was meant to influence people one way, and then they're arguing about how they should be influenced and whether it was a legitimate influence. So I think there are lots of different ways to do that. And every communication context has slightly different dynamics, for sure. Absolutely. But in terms of the processes of polarization, community detection, local language, who they engage, those things I think are fairly common across those modes. But it is true, I don't know if this is where you're going, that it is true that all of this language-based approach has to also be attentive to the local discourse used by people, right? And so this is where a lot of large language models are trying to get better now because different people talk about things in different ways. And if you're not attentive to that and you impose a general way of understanding language, you're actually going to miss the way that they're talking to each other. Yeah? So I think there's some nice new ways now of trying to build that in, actually local discourse, and actually teaching models to recognize even the emergence of ways of talking about things. Like Black Lives Matter, it emerged as a way of talking about things. But we can even get down into syntax and words for talking about things, right? Like, for example, a lot of social media companies started regulating any reference to death or killing, right? They have models that are trained to, you're looking surprised, you're not, yeah. There are tools that actually regulate language and stop those posts. So people have to create a new way, a new vocabulary, language for talking about that thing without getting caught by the censors.
So they're not allowed to talk about death or killing?
Yeah, there's certain active verbs for killing that have been regulated.
That's what TikTok has to say, rape.
Yes. Yeah. Unlive.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's constantly evolving, that's right. Without attending to the way that it's evolving in a particular community or genre, you could miss, yeah. Yeah, I'll come to you next, Dave.
Okay, so this is kind of a different question, more towards the EEG research that you did. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard you say something along the lines of like, even when white folks were exposed to like, the images of police brutality against other white people, that this sort of pattern still held for them, and that they were, for lack of a better term, almost like apathetic afterwards, if I'm not like, if I'm understanding that correctly. I guess in that sense, if individuals in that group, at least the ones that were surveyed, didn't respond to police killing or brutalizing Black people, they didn't respond to police brutalizing people who looked like them, how do you get a subset of people who are not having that kind of response to like, I guess like that one Onion article that's like, I don't know how to convince you that you should care about other people. Like, how do you get people to like care about that kind of thing if even seeing people who look like them experience it and it hitting close to home in that sense if they're not being mobilized to action?
Yeah. So a couple of things. So they are reacting, but just early on because it's unusual, right? Even the police use of violence against white targets, they're reacting in a way that seems like they're saying they're surprised and they're showing what looks like a novelty reaction. So they're reacting, it's just not sustained with indicators that we think suggest relevance. So they are reacting. So when we actually show them the images and ask them what's happening, what do you make of this? I was actually talking to Nick about this because this is like a lesson that I learned in this research that showed my own, ignorance about this. When we asked them to like tell us the story of what's happening in those pictures, the majority of white folks say the cop must have had some reason to do that. The second before, the target must have done something, right? And Black folks have a different narrative. So there's something about the assumption about the police subordinating someone that for lots of folks the assumption is it must be legitimate. There's a reason. And I was surprised by that. I did not expect that. But it's pretty profound. And the other thing there that's super important, I only hinted at this, is I'm obsessed with variance. And in that study, the variance is actually very narrow. Those effects are so big because most people in those two different groups are reacting in a very similar way, which makes the effects bigger. And they really walked in with a big difference of what they know about these issues, right? So then, yes, I got really interested in like, what is the profile of are there white participants who have the typical Black profile? And who are they? because I thought those people are really interesting. And they're extreme. So there's about, depending on the study, we've done about 8 variations of those studies, 10 to 12% of the white participants look like the typical black participant. And they basically max out on any attitudinal scale of racial egalitarianism. They're really, you almost would consider them outliers. They're extreme in all those ideological measures. So there is that group, and then when you ask them about their experience, they're people who have an ecology, an ecological experience of the world that looks more like the black participants. There's some reason why they paid attention or they know about past incidents. So they've come into the study with a very different experience of the world and a very different view of it. But it's a very, very small minority, and they really are very different from the rest of their group. And it's actually not very strongly tied to political ideology. I'll come to you in a second. I think Dave was.
I switched the question. The question I was going to ask is universalistic notions of truth, morality, and justice. I'd submit no democracy has ever actually had a consensus on that, including the United States, nor will it ever. So how do you pull that off? But I'm thinking that question, how do you pull it off when people don't have that? The question I will have is given our ability to have interactions over electronic media, there's a lot of speech, but it isn't necessarily conversation. Electronic media allows you to pontificate, allows you to argue, it allows you to proclaim. It doesn't necessarily allow you to converse with another person. Can you measure conversation? Or can you produce conversation? Which means you actually interact with other people, you listen to their arguments, you understand them, you do so in a courteous and polite way, and you respond. Is there any way even to promote conversation as opposed to just verbiage?
So I'm going to disagree with you a little bit and say that I don't think the issues you raise are inherent to social media. There is conversation on social media. There are things besides conversation.
There's a lot that's not, and that could be an issue.
I'm actually not sure that distribution is what you think it is. We get a lot of focus on the extremes, but like that's why I showed you so that early evolution in those days after where people are really talking to each other, they're really talking to each other about what happened. They're conversing. They're offering different frames. They're putting it in a historical perspective. They're talking about the details. That's conversation. It does happen.
That would be great.
So but of course, I think where things may end up, or the thing that we attend to is the end result. But how they got there is there's information sharing, there's news sharing, there's conversation, there's debate, education, whatever you want. That's all happening. And that's actually my point. Like if we only focus on what happens at the end and these polarized separate silos, we're not understanding how we got there through conversation.
You said something about that the person writing the story does not choose the title or the photo.
Yeah.
So the title and photo are, I can imagine a newspaper, but I suppose it's also, people are actually clicking on the titles of the photos.
Yeah.
Which has a tremendous framing influence on how people are going to, what they expect and how they're going to read the story. So you're saying the media are not interested because people are interested not in a maximum amount of novelty, not too much.
Yeah.
And it seems that they could get the novelty in there in a different way instead of another police in this kind of, thing, but no interest.
I think for a couple of reasons, right? One is it's disturbing, right? Because journalists think that. So, for example, think about for many of these journalists saying that they look like their sources, their newspaper looks exactly like Fox News is like not something they want to hear. So that's part of it. But there's a reason for the homogeneity, which is these featured images and news headlines are being chosen by basically the same set of people or some similar types of people. So the homogeneity is actually institutional, not so, but I think for them it's very disturbing to see that line where it doesn't really matter what the source is. There's a lot of consensus or agreement about how to represent it.
That they're all doing the same thing.
Yes, but then their answer is, well, we don't do that.
How did they even come to do it? I mean, was it a conscious choice? Are they running algorithms or did they just learn it without any notes?
I mean, it's a good question. So there's a special editorial role that does this.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are more data-driven than others. For many of them, it's intuitive, but it kind of depends on the source. But that's basically a separate. So if you're a reporter, you write your article about what have you, you submit it, then it goes to that editor to pair or generate a headline and a featured image to go with your article that you only learn about after it's appeared. So some of that is data-driven. And some of that is style of the newspaper, is an intuitive sense of their audience and what they'd be interested in and what would grab their attention. So there was that disengagement for those two reasons. It's not our fault, because other people do that, and we don't want to look like our least favorite. We don't want to hear that we look just like our least favorite newspaper on the other end of the political spectrum. So, I mean, there's a whole conversation here about the role of journalism in this too, and in feeding civil discourse. And this is part of it, right? The way that journalism has been institutionalized now, taken over by multinationals who also share images to save money on images. There's a whole political economy of journalism that is feeding into this homogenization of news representation.
Right, and a lack of solutions if it's always the same story in a sense. Be prepared to read the same story over and over again and not notice it's different.
Yeah, so that's actually, I forgot, that's a hopeful note, right? So there's a way that other countries have other ways of doing this, of really investing in public news and journalism.
What do they do?
Lots of other models. So for example, there's some UK sources in here, and those headlines look very different. So there are ways to invest and fund and to protect newspapers from those larger institutional forces that resist the homogenization of headlines and images. But there are structural changes about the way news is funded and the economic model of news that the models that I know of are all about public investment in news, which we have moved away from in this country. And this is the consequence.
Let's move the discussion to X, Blue Sky, Threads, TikTok, or venues of your choice. Let's have another round of applause and appreciation.